In the quiet but deceptively tense city of Genoa City, where power struggles and family legacies shape every waking moment, the fragile balance between the Abbott and NEWMAN families was about to shatter in a way no one could have predicted. For years, the rivalry between Victor NEWMAN and Jack Abbott had fueled endless schemes, betrayals, and ruthless business maneuvers, but what unfolded on that cold evening pushed the feud into terrifying new territory. At the center of the chaos was Kyle Abbott, a young man who had spent much of his life trying to step out of his father's shadow and prove himself worthy of the Abbott legacy. Kyle had faced corporate battles, romantic complications, and family conflicts before, but nothing prepared him for the moment his life would hang by a thread because of a plan that spiraled beyond control. The evening began quietly enough. Kyle had just left Chabot after a long meeting about the company's latest expansion strategy. He had spoken with his mother, Diane Jenkins, earlier that day, reassuring her that things between the Abbotts and the NEWMANs were tense but manageable. Diane, however, felt a strange unease she couldn't shake. She had lived long enough in Genoa City to recognize when the calm before the storm was approaching, especially when Victor NEWMAN was involved. Victor had been unusually quiet in recent weeks, and that silence worried her more than any open threat ever could. Meanwhile, at the NEWMAN ranch, Victor was reviewing a series of reports brought to him by trusted associates. His goal had always been simple in his mind: protect the NEWMAN empire and keep the Abbott family from undermining his power. Yet Victor's methods often blurred the line between strategy and cruelty, and even those closest to him had begun to question whether his relentless pursuit of dominance had gone too far. Earlier that afternoon, Victor had ordered a subtle surveillance operation. He suspected that Jack Abbott was preparing a corporate maneuver that could weaken NEWMAN Enterprises in the coming months. Victor wasn't about to sit back and let that happen. His plan, at least as he explained it to his team, was meant to send a message, not to harm anyone physically, but to make it clear that crossing him carried consequences. What Victor didn't fully anticipate was how dangerous the execution of that plan could become once other people began carrying it out. Somewhere between the initial orders and the final steps of the scheme, the situation twisted into something far more volatile. As Kyle drove down a quiet stretch of road outside Genoa City that night, he had no idea that he was about to become the unwilling centerpiece of a plot designed to intimidate his family. The roads were slick from an earlier rain, and the sky hung heavy with dark clouds that seemed to press down on the city like a warning. Kyle's mind was focused on work and on his family, especially on his complicated relationship with his parents and his determination to prove that he could lead Chabot into the future. He had no reason to suspect that another vehicle had been following him for miles. The headlights stayed just far enough behind to avoid drawing attention, yet close enough that whoever was inside could track Kyle's every turn. Back at the Abbott mansion, Diane was pacing the living room while Jack Abbott tried to calm her nerves. Diane insisted that something was wrong. Jack dismissed it at first, believing that the tension of the ongoing rivalry with Victor had simply made everyone paranoid. But Diane couldn't shake the feeling that Kyle was in danger. She attempted to call him several times, only to hear his phone go straight to voicemail. Each unanswered call tightened the knot in her chest. Meanwhile, Kyle continued driving through the outskirts of town, unaware that the vehicle behind him had suddenly accelerated. The moment unfolded in a blur. A black SUV surged forward and deliberately clipped the rear of Kyle's car. The impact sent his vehicle spinning across the slick pavement. Tires screamed against the road as Kyle struggled to regain control, but the second hit came even harder. Metal crunched violently as the car veered off the highway and slammed into a guardrail before flipping onto its side. The crash echoed through the night like a thunderclap. For a few terrifying seconds, everything was silent except for the ticking of the damaged engine and the distant sound of wind whipping across the empty road. Kyle lay unconscious behind the wheel, blood running down the side of his face as the car's airbag slowly deflated. The SUV lingered for only a moment before disappearing into the darkness. Whoever had been driving it had no intention of staying to help. Within minutes, a passing motorist noticed the wreckage and called emergency services. Sirens pierced the night as paramedics rushed to the scene, their flashing lights reflecting off twisted metal and shattered glass. When they pulled Kyle from the wreckage, his condition was critical. His pulse was weak, and the paramedics could see immediately that he had suffered severe trauma. The ambulance sped toward Genoa City Memorial Hospital, while doctors prepared for a life-or-death emergency. At nearly the same time, Diane's phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm but urgent, a police officer informing her that her son had been involved in a serious accident. For a moment, Diane couldn't even process the words. The room seemed to spin around her as the reality crashed down. Jack rushed to her side as she struggled to explain what she had just heard. Within minutes, they were racing toward the hospital, fear gripping them both as they prayed Kyle would survive. When they arrived, the scene inside the hospital was chaotic. Doctors and nurses rushed through the halls while Kyle was wheeled into surgery. Diane's heart shattered when she caught a glimpse of her son through the doors of the emergency room, his body covered in blood and medical equipment. Jack tried to stay strong for her, but the sight shook him to his core. This wasn't just an accident. It felt too sudden, too violent, too suspicious. And deep down, both of them knew that the ongoing war with the NEWMANs might somehow be connected. As hours passed in agonizing uncertainty, Diane began piecing together clues that would lead her to a devastating conclusion. A detective arrived to gather details about Kyle's recent activities. When Diane mentioned the growing tension with Victor, the detective exchanged a subtle glance with his partner. That small reaction ignited Diane's instincts. She had survived countless manipulations in Genoa City, and she knew when something didn't add up. Determined to uncover the truth, Diane began making calls of her own, reaching out to contacts who might know what had really happened on that road. Meanwhile, at the NEWMAN ranch, Victor was sitting in his study when he received an unexpected phone call from one of the men involved in the earlier operation. The man's voice trembled as he explained that things had gone terribly wrong. Victor's expression hardened as he listened. The plan had never been meant to cause a catastrophic accident. It was supposed to scare the Abbotts, nothing more. But hearing that Kyle Abbott was now fighting for his life in a hospital bed forced Victor to confront the possibility that his strategy had unleashed consequences even he could not control. Back at the hospital, Diane received the call that confirmed her worst suspicions. One of her sources had obtained traffic camera footage from the road where Kyle crashed. The footage showed the black SUV striking Kyle's car deliberately before speeding away. But what truly shocked Diane was the license plate trace. The vehicle had been registered to a shell company tied directly to Victor NEWMAN. When Diane realized what that meant, a wave of fury surged through her. This wasn't a random accident, it was a trap. And Victor NEWMAN had set it. The realization hit Diane like a lightning bolt. Her son was lying in surgery, possibly dying, because Victor wanted to intimidate the Abbott family. The rage that filled her was unlike anything she had felt before. She turned to Jack, her voice shaking with anger as she revealed the truth. Jack's face went pale, then hardened with cold determination. If Victor had crossed this line, there would be no going back. The rivalry that had defined Genoa City for decades had just become something darker and far more dangerous. Inside the operating room, doctors fought desperately to stabilize Kyle. Hours passed before the surgeon finally stepped into the waiting room. Diane and Jack jumped to their feet, their hearts pounding as they waited for the verdict. The doctor explained that Kyle had suffered multiple internal injuries and a severe head trauma. He was alive, but barely. The next 24 hours would determine whether he survived. As Diane listened, the words echoed in her mind, barely alive. Her son was on the brink of death because of Victor's ruthless scheme. In that moment, Diane made a silent vow. If Victor NEWMAN thought he could destroy the Abbott family without consequences, he had made the biggest mistake of his life. And across town, as Victor NEWMAN stared out into the darkness from his ranch, even he began to realize that the war he had reignited might soon spiral beyond anyone's control. The line between power and destruction had been crossed, and now the entire city of Genoa City would feel the shockwaves. The battle between the NEWMANs and the Abbotts had turned deadly, and the fight for survival had only just begun. The The waiting room at Genoa City Memorial felt colder than usual as the hours dragged on. Every ticking second seemed louder, every whispered conversation more tense. Diane Jenkins sat stiffly in a chair near the window, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. Across from her, Jack Abbott paced the floor like a caged animal, unable to remain still. Neither of them had slept, and neither of them could stop replaying the same horrifying thought: Kyle Abbott might not survive the night. The surgeon's words echoed relentlessly in Diane's mind. Critical condition. Severe trauma. The next 24 hours would determine everything. She had lived through danger before in Genoa City, betrayals, schemes, and endless power struggles, but nothing compared to the helpless terror of watching her own child fight for his life. Jack suddenly stopped pacing and looked at her. "We're not going to lose him," Jack said, though his voice carried more determination than certainty. Diane wanted to believe him. She truly did. But the images she had seen when Kyle was wheeled past them were impossible to forget, his face pale beneath streaks of blood, machines already connected to him, doctors shouting instructions as they rushed toward surgery. And the worst part of it all was the knowledge forming like ice in her chest. This wasn't an accident. This was Victor NEWMAN's doing. Across town at the NEWMAN ranch, Victor NEWMAN stood near the fireplace in his study, staring into the flames as if the answers he needed might appear in the shifting light. The ranch was unusually quiet. Normally, the place carried an air of confidence and control, but tonight something darker hung in the air. Victor had built his empire through bold decisions and ruthless strategy. He had crushed competitors, outmaneuvered enemies, and survived countless betrayals. But the call he received earlier that night had shaken even him. Kyle Abbott. Critical condition. A car accident tied to an operation Victor had authorized. Victor's jaw tightened as he replayed the conversation with his operative. The man insisted the mission had only been meant to scare Kyle, force him off the road for a moment, send a warning to the Abbott family. There had never been an order to cause a catastrophic crash. Yet the outcome was exactly that. Victor was many things: calculating, relentless, and fiercely protective of his family, but he had never intended to push things this far. If Kyle died, the consequences would ripple through every corner of Genoa City, and the blame would land squarely on him. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, the Abbott family was slowly gathering. Ashley Abbott arrived first, rushing through the hospital doors with panic written across her face. She had been woken by Jack's call and immediately flown back to Genoa City. "Where is he?" Ashley demanded breathlessly. Diane stood up, her voice trembling. "He's in intensive care. They're still monitoring him." Ashley looked from Diane to Jack, confusion turning into dread. "What happened?" Jack's expression darkened. "A trap," he said quietly. "And I'm almost certain I know who said it." Ashley didn't need him to say the name out loud. "Victor," she whispered. The room fell silent. The feud between the Abbotts and NEWMANs had always been fierce, but even Ashley struggled to imagine Victor NEWMAN going so far that someone could end up dying. But the evidence Diane had uncovered told a different story. A surveillance vehicle tied to Victor's network. A deliberate hit on Kyle's car. A carefully orchestrated setup. Ashley's shock quickly transformed into anger. "If Victor did this," she said slowly, "he's going to regret it for the rest of his life." Not long after, another familiar face appeared in the waiting room. Summer NEWMAN. Summer's eyes were red from crying, and the moment she spotted Diane and Jack, she rushed toward them. "Is it true?" she asked desperately. "Kyle was in a crash?" Diane nodded, tears forming again. "He's fighting for his life." Summer covered her mouth as the words hit her like a physical blow. Kyle wasn't just part of the Abbott family, he was part of her life in a way that had never truly faded. Their relationship had endured countless complications, but the bond between them remained strong. "Can I see him?" she asked. "The doctors are limiting visitors," Jack replied gently. "But they said maybe later." Summer sat down heavily, trying to steady her breathing. She had grown up in the NEWMAN family, and she knew how far Victor NEWMAN could go when he believed someone threatened his empire. But this felt unimaginable. But Nikki didn't even glance at him. "What did he do?" she demanded. Patty leaned forward slightly, savoring the suspense she was creating. Ask him about the plan he put into motion, she said. The one that's already starting to unravel. Nikki turned slowly toward Victor. For decades, she had stood beside him through wars of business, family feuds, betrayals, and reconciliations. She had defended him when the rest of Genoa City accused him of manipulation and ruthless ambition. She had believed that no matter how extreme his methods sometimes seemed, his intentions were always about protecting the people he loved. But the doubt creeping into her mind now was impossible to ignore. "Victor," she said quietly, "what plan?" Victor's gaze remained steady, but Nikki knew him too well to miss the subtle tension in his posture. "You're letting her manipulate you," he replied. "That's not an answer." Patty clapped her hands once with childish excitement. "Oh, this is priceless," she laughed. Victor shot her a deadly glare. "Security will remove her," he said, reaching for his phone. Nikki stepped directly in front of him. "You're not calling anyone until you answer me." Victor lowered the phone slowly. For the first time since Patty arrived, the focus shifted entirely to the couple standing in the center of the patio. "Everything I do is for this family," Victor repeated firmly. Nikki shook her head. "You've used that excuse before." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. "Excuse?" "Yes," Nikki said, her voice rising. "Because sometimes it feels like you use that line to justify whatever scheme you've cooked up." Patty leaned against the railing, clearly enjoying the unfolding argument. Victor ignored her. "Nikki, you know better than anyone how this world works." "I know how you work," she shot back. The wind picked up across the ranch grounds, stirring the tension even further. "You make decisions without telling anyone," Nikki continued. "Then you expect us to trust you when the consequences explode." Victor's voice dropped lower. "Sometimes the truth would only create unnecessary fear. And sometimes the truth is exactly what people deserve." Their eyes locked in a silent battle. For a moment Patty almost disappeared from the equation entirely. The confrontation had evolved into something much deeper, a reckoning between two people whose love had survived decades of conflict, but was now straining under the weight of secrecy. "You promised me," Nikki said quietly, "no more dangerous games." Victor hesitated. That hesitation was all Nikki needed to confirm her fears. "Oh my God," she whispered. Patty laughed again. "See? She's finally catching up." Nikki turned back toward Patty with blazing anger. "If you're lying." "I'm not," Patty interrupted. Victor stepped forward again. "This ends now." But Nikki refused to move. "No, Victor. It doesn't." Her voice shook, but not from weakness. "You owe me the truth." Victor studied her face carefully. Despite all the power he wielded, all the influence he commanded, there was one person in the world who could still challenge him on an emotional level. Nikki NEWMAN. And tonight she wasn't backing down. Patty suddenly pushed herself off the railing. "Well," she said dramatically, "I think my work here is done." Victor turned toward her sharply. "You're not going anywhere until security arrives." But Patty just smiled. "Oh please. You've got bigger problems than me now." She gestured toward Nikki. Victor remained silent. Patty walked slowly toward the steps of the patio. "Tick-tock, Victor," she called over her shoulder. Then she disappeared into the darkness of the ranch grounds. The moment she was gone, the air felt strangely hollow. But Nikki didn't relax. She turned back toward Victor. "Start talking." Victor sighed heavily, something he rarely allowed himself to do in front of others. "You're letting her poison your mind." "No," Nikki replied. "You did that yourself." Victor's expression hardened slightly. "What exactly do you think I've done?" "I think you've been hiding something," Nikki said. "And I think whatever it is has the potential to blow up this entire family." Victor remained silent. That silence spoke louder than any denial. Nikki's frustration erupted again. "You see? This is exactly what I'm talking about." Her voice echoed across the patio. "You keep shutting people out and then you're surprised when everything falls apart." Victor finally spoke again. "You're overreacting." Nikki let out a bitter laugh. "Overreacting?" Her anger surged again. "A woman storms onto our property screaming about one of your secret plans, and you expect me to pretend it's nothing?" Victor folded his arms. "You should know by now that people like Patty thrive on chaos. And you thrive on control, Nikki snapped. The words hung heavily between them. Victor's eyes darkened. I control situations so this family doesn't become vulnerable. But sometimes your control creates the danger, Nikki said. The argument had reached a point neither of them could easily retreat from.